In the depths of darkness begins the tale of a kingdom ruled by a ruthless king whose eyes burned with pride and whose words carried the weight of fire. The people trembled at his very name, and the echo of his footsteps felt like an earthquake across the land. He saw his throne as higher than the skies and imagined himself a god upon the earth. Yet he forgot that behind every power lies the certainty of downfall. His mornings were thirsty for blood, and his nights were filled with the cries of the oppressed. He commanded gatherings in the palace courtyard where prisoners were dragged in chains, their bodies trembling as whips and blades struck them. The people were forced to watch in fear, chained their tongues, for their lives were dearer to them than their voices. The walls of the fortress bore stains of blood that never faded, and every stone seemed to cry out that such cruelty could not last. Yet the king's ears were deaf. He saw only his power and listened only to his desires. One day, he ordered that the poorest village of the realm be burned to the ground to show the price of defying his command. Soldiers marched, and flames devoured the homes. Women, children, and elders were swallowed by fire. Their screams rose to the heavens, but the king watched from the balcony of his palace, smiling as though this spectacle was his glory and his greatness. That night, for the first time, his sleep was shaken. He dreamed of himself, bound in chains, the very throne he ruled from transformed into his prison, the people standing around him, laughing at his fall. He tried to shout, but his voice was trapped in his throat. He woke drenched in sweat, trembling, yet his pride refused to admit the truth. By morning, he sat again in his court, seeking to refresh the fear in his people's hearts, but something was different in the air. The eyes of the crowd no longer held the same terror. Their heads bowed, yet in their gaze burned resentment. The soldiers, too, carried doubt. Their hands trembled as they obeyed his orders, their eyes heavy with hidden questions. The king tried to dismiss it as weakness, but a storm was brewing unseen. The moment was drawing nearer when those questions would turn into rebellion, and the throne he called his heaven would become his grave. The shadow of fear still ruled the land, but whispers of defiance began to flow through the villages like sparks ready to become fire. The king, whose arrogance knew no end, believed his cruelty was unshakable. Yet destiny had begun to weave a different path in the marketplace. People lowered their voices when his name was spoken, yet behind their silence grew a storm of anger. In the depth of this unease, a wandering sage appeared in the capital, his robe torn, his feet blistered, yet his eyes glowing with a light that unsettled even the bravest guards. He walked into the royal court without fear, his voice steady as he declared, "O king, your throne stands tall, but your pride has dug its grave. Every drop of innocent blood calls to the heavens, and the heavens do not forget. Your end will come swifter than you imagine." The court froze, the courtiers trembled, yet the king erupted in laughter, mocking the sage as a mad beggar. His pride could not allow the warning to pierce his heart. He ordered the guards to lash the sage and cast him beyond the gates of the city. But even as the whip struck, the sage did not cry. Instead, he spoke again, saying, "The chain of your cruelty is heavy, and soon it will fall upon you yourself." These words like poison entered the king's mind that night. Sleep escaped him again. His dreams returned, darker than before. He saw fires raging through his palace, his soldiers abandoning him, his crown broken in dust, and the laughter of the people echoing like thunder. He woke shaken, but his pride remained a shield, refusing to admit fear. By morning, he ordered grand celebrations to display his power, forcing musicians to play louder, forcing servants to spread golden feasts, forcing captives to kneel before his throne. The people clapped out of fear, but in their eyes the same fire burned stronger. Every act of cruelty turned into fuel for rebellion. Rumors spread that the sage had vanished into the forests, but his words still echoed through the villages. Men whispered them at night, women repeated them to their children, and slowly, the curse of truth began to grow. The king still sat upon his throne, radiant in jewels, believing his rule eternal, but the storm outside, the walls grew louder, with every heartbeat unseen and unstoppable. Dark clouds gathered over the kingdom as if the skies themselves had grown. Weary of the king's cruelty, the once golden fields were now barren. The rivers seemed to flow slower, as though burdened by sorrow, and the air carried a weight that pressed upon every heart. Yet within the palace, the king sat with pride shining in his eyes and jewels glittering on his robes, unaware that his world had begun to crack. On this day he summoned his ministers, demanding to know why whispers of rebellion echoed through the streets. The ministers, trembling with fear, spoke of hunger among the poor, the cruelty of taxes, and the restlessness of soldiers, but the king silenced them with a single glare, declaring that his sword was the only law, and his throne unshakable still. That night, when the moon cast pale light through the high windows, he could not escape the shadow of his dreams. Again he saw himself chained, his throne consumed by fire, his people laughing and pointing as he cried out for mercy. The visions grew sharper. He heard the voices of children wailing, the curses of widows, and the prayers of men who begged for justice. He awoke with a scream, his heart pounding like a drum, yet his pride once more denied him the wisdom to repent. To bury his fear, he ordered grander punishments. He demanded that new prisoners be dragged to the courtyard, and that their cries echo through the land. He believed that if the people saw more terror, they would forget their courage. But as the whips struck the captives, the crowd no longer looked down. Their eyes burned with anger. They whispered to one another, though their lips barely moved. Even the soldiers carrying out the punishments hesitated, their hands shaking, their loyalty fading like smoke in the wind. The king noticed their weakness, and rage filled him. He shouted that any soldier who disobeyed would be executed. Yet deep inside he felt a cold dread, for he knew fear was no longer enough to bind their loyalty. Outside the palace walls, villagers gathered in secret fires, burning low as they planned how to end the chains of cruelty. Men swore oaths of resistance, women prepared food and water for the day of uprising, and children listened wide-eyed to the tale of the wandering sage who had promised that the king would fall. The kingdom breathed in silence, but the silence was no longer of fear. It was the silence of a storm waiting to strike, unseen but inevitable. The throne that once gleamed like the sun now stood under the shadow of fear. As cracks of doubt spread across the palace walls, the king still roared with the same voice, but its echo no longer shook hearts. The courtiers bowed, yet behind lowered heads their minds raced with thoughts of betrayal. Ministers gathered in secret chambers, whispering that the empire had become a cage of blood and chains, and sooner or later, the bars would break. The king, blind in his arrogance, ordered new statues to be raised across the kingdom, carved in his own image. He demanded that every village kneel before his likeness, thinking that stone and iron could secure devotion. Yet when workers were forced to build these monuments, they cursed under their breath, and when the statues were raised, people spat upon the ground as they passed by, for they saw not glory, but mockery. The soldiers who guarded the palace began to change as well, their hearts heavy with shame, their hands trembling each time they lifted a whip. Some deserted in the dark of night, vanishing into forests to join the rebels, while those who remained walked with eyes lowered, refusing to meet the gaze of the people. The king, sensing the shift, grew restless. His dreams continued to torment him. Each night, he saw rivers of fire consuming his palace. Each morning, he awoke drenched in sweat, yet he hid his terror with louder cruelty, ordering more executions, demanding that the screams of the dying drown the whispers of defiance. But the people no longer trembled. They clenched their fists in silence. Children repeated the words of the wandering sage, that no throne built on blood can stand forever. farmers in distant fields spoke of rebellion. As they sowed seeds, merchants passing through the city carried tales of unrest from one village to another. Even the winds seemed to carry the promise of change. The palace that once stood as a fortress of power had become a prison of fear for its ruler. His jewels and treasures glittered in the halls, but their shine no longer brought him peace. The air around him felt colder, the silence of the courtiers heavier, the shadows of the night longer and deeper. He tried to convince himself that his rule was eternal, but every glance, every whisper, every trembling hand reminded him that the end of tyranny was drawing near, and nothing could stop the storm preparing to strike. The fire of rebellion had not yet erupted, but its smoke was rising across the horizon, and even the skies seemed to carry the weight of change. The king still walked through his marble halls draped in robes heavy with jewels, but in his heart shadows whispered louder than the voices of his courtiers. He sought to silence the fear clawing inside him by summoning his generals, demanding that they crush every whisper of defiance. The generals bowed their heads, but their eyes revealed hesitation, for they too had seen the growing anger in the eyes of the soldiers. The king ordered that patrols march through every village, that taxes be doubled, that spies be planted in every market to root out traitors. His voice thundered like a storm, but the walls of the palace no longer carried its power. They absorbed it like a dying echo. In the villages men refused to bow their heads, women spoke with courage, children carved signs of resistance in the dirt. Elders recalled the words of the wandering sage, whose warning had spread like wildfire. No throne built on cruelty shall remain. The soldiers tasked with punishing these villagers began to falter, their swords heavy, their hearts torn between loyalty and justice. Some slipped messages to the rebels, warning them of raids. Others deliberately slowed their marches to give peasants time to flee. The king, blind in his fury, accused his own ministers of treachery. He had them dragged from the court, their cries echoing through the corridors. But this display only fueled the rage outside. The once loyal city began to murmur openly. Markets buzzed with talk of uprising. Merchants refused to pay taxes, and peasants began sharpening their farming tools into weapons. The king stood at his balcony, overlooking the restless crowd below. He raised his hands to declare his eternal rule, but instead of awe he saw eyes blazing with hatred. He returned to his chambers, shaking, yet he told himself that fear would bind them. Again he summoned musicians, ordered a feast, forced laughter in the hall, but behind every smile he saw only shadows. The night grew darker as the moon hid behind clouds, and thunder rolled across the skies. The king laid on his golden bed, but his dreams returned fiercer than ever. He saw flames devouring his banners. He saw chains tightening around his wrists. He heard the voice of the sage saying, "Your own throne will become your cage." He woke in terror, his heart racing, yet his pride whispered lies, telling him that the people would never dare touch him. But far beyond the palace walls, the storm of rebellion was no longer a whisper, it was a roar, waiting for the dawn to strike. The storm that had long rumbled in silence finally began to shake the foundations of the kingdom. The ground itself seemed to echo with the footsteps of a people no longer willing to bow. The king stood tall upon his balcony, his crown glittering in the sun, but his heart felt heavier than iron. He had ordered new punishments harsher than before, thinking that terror would silence rebellion. Yet every lash of the whip, every cry of pain only added fuel to the fire. His soldiers, once the steel of his power, now moved with hesitation, their loyalty torn, their eyes filled with question. Some deserted, openly walking out of the palace gates. Without fear, others secretly passed food and weapons to villagers waiting in the forests. The ministers whispered in corners, their voices trembling as they spoke of revolt spreading like wildfire across the land. The king, sensing betrayal, lashed out with rage. He accused his most trusted advisor of treason and had him executed before the court, but instead of fear he saw disgust in the faces of those who watched the markets. Now no longer buzzed with fear, but with open defiance. Vendors refused to pay the heavy taxes, farmers kept their harvest hidden, and children sang songs mocking the throne. The wandering sage, though unseen, was spoken of everywhere. His words lived on, like fire carried in the hearts of the people. No cruelty lasts forever, no crown escapes judgment. The king, though tormented by dreams each night, refused to bend his pride. Told him he was immortal, that his throne was unshakable. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw chains binding his hands and flames consuming his banners. When he opened them, he saw his court thinning, his soldiers restless, his people unafraid. The walls of his fortress, once symbols of power, now felt like walls of a prison. His laughter rang hollow in the grand halls that echoed with silence. He sought to prove his strength by planning a grand parade through the capital. He ordered his soldiers to march, his banners to fly, his chariots to roll. But when the day came, the crowd that gathered did not cheer. Their eyes were hard, their silence heavier than 1,000 shouts. He raised his hand, expecting applause, but what met him was the sound of murmurs rising into chants that carried the promise of rebellion. He clenched his fists, his pride screaming that he still ruled, yet deep within he felt the ground trembling, as if the very earth had begun to rise against him. The storm was no longer distant, it had reached his gates, and the throne upon which he sat had begun to crack beneath him. The palace that once stood as the heart of power now trembled with the sound of voices rising beyond its gates. The rebellion that had been a whisper was now a roar carried by thousands who no longer feared death. The king, dressed in gold and steel, stood upon his balcony, expecting the crowd to bow, but instead he saw a sea of defiance. Their fists raised, their eyes burning with fury. The air shook with chants of freedom. The streets overflowed with men, women, and children united by pain and anger. Soldiers who once stood proudly before the throne now hesitated. Some even lowered their weapons, refusing to strike the people they once called their own. The king screamed orders, his voice echoing across the courtyard, demanding loyalty, threatening death. But his words fell like ashes in the wine. The ministers who once praised him now hid in silence, afraid to be seen at his side. The wandering sage, though unseen, was in every heart, his prophecy alive in every chant. No crown forged in cruelty will survive, no throne drenched in blood will stand forever. The king, enraged, ordered the archers to fire upon the crowd. Yet the archers held their bows steady, but did not release their arrows, their eyes fixed upon the people who could have been their mothers, their brothers, their children. The king felt his power slipping like sand through his fingers. He clenched his fists in rage and fear, his mind clouded by memories of his dreams. The chains, the flames, the mocking laughter. He shouted that he was eternal, that no one could touch him. But the crowd roared louder, drowning his voice with chants of justice, justice, justice. The palace walls shook with their power. The marble floors beneath him trembled as if the very earth had turned against his rule. Still, desperate, he ordered the gates sealed. But within the walls, betrayal had already taken root. Servants whispered secrets, soldiers passed keys, rebels found hidden paths into the fortress. By nightfall the palace was surrounded. Torches lit the skies like a sea of fire. The chants rose into the heavens. The storm had arrived, and the tyrant stood alone upon his crumbling throne. The night of fire had arrived. The sky glowed red with the light of countless torches, and the roar of the people thundered against the walls of the palace. The king stood within his grand hall, surrounded by pillars of marble and banners of gold. But for the first time the palace felt like a tomb. He ordered his guards to defend the gates, to spill the blood of every rebel who dared to step forward. Yet his command met hesitation. The soldiers looked at one another uncertain, their swords heavy in their hands. Some dropped their weapons and fled. Others stood frozen as the chants outside grew louder, going through every corridor of the fortress. The king raged, his voice breaking as he demanded loyalty. He threatened death. He promised glory, but none of his words carried power any longer. His crown felt heavier than iron. Upon his head sweat rolled down his face as he recalled the dreams that had haunted him. The chains, the flames, the voice of the sage. He tried to silence them, but now they were alive before his very eyes. The rebels forced their way through hidden tunnels opened by those inside the palace who could no longer endure tyranny. They surged into the courtyards, their cries shaking the night. Soldiers who remained loyal tried to resist, but many turned their blades away, unwilling to fight their own people. The clash of steel rang through the halls, the marble floors stained with blood, but the rebels pressed forward unstoppable. The king retreated deeper into his chambers, clutching his scepter, as if it could still command the world. He looked upon the statues, built in his image, towering over the palace gardens, and for the first time he saw not glory, but emptiness. He shouted that he was the chosen ruler, that no hand could touch him. Yet, even as he spoke, the sound of footsteps grew nearer, rebels breaking through doors, shattering the silence. He fled into the throne room, the place he believed unshakable, yet its walls trembled with every cry outside. The throne that had once lifted him above all now seemed like a trap waiting to swallow him. The fire of rebellion burned brighter than the torches as men, women, and children stormed the palace, their eyes fierce, their voices unbroken. The king stood shaking upon the steps of his throne, his pride cracking, his power collapsing. The storm had entered the heart of his kingdom, and the tyrant was no longer untouchable. The throne room that had once gleamed with gold now shook with the thunder of footsteps as the rebels burst through the great doors, their cries filling the air like a storm without end. The king sat upon his throne, his crown tilted, his eyes wild with fury and fear. He raised his scepter as if it still held power, but the people saw only a broken tyrant. His voice cracked as he declared that he was eternal, that no hand could strip him of his crown. Yet his words were drowned by the roar of freedom that echoed through the chamber. The rebels advanced their torches, casting shadows upon the marble walls, each flame dancing like judgment itself. The soldiers who remained at the king's side wavered, their blades shaking in their grip, until one by one they stepped back, unwilling to fight against their own brothers and sisters. The king screamed betrayal, his voice echoing through the vaulted hall, but no one listened. He struck the marble floor with his scepter, demanding silence, yet the sound was swallowed by the chants of justice, justice, justice. The ministers who once bowed at his feet now hid behind pillars, trembling in silence. The king, desperate to cling to power, rose from his throne, his robe dragging upon the blood-stained floor. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with madness. He shouted that the gods themselves had chosen him, that the throne was his forever. But the people had seen enough of his cruelty. They surged forward, filling the hall like a river breaking its dam. The king raised his hand to command the storm, but his own voice was lost. The scepter was torn from his grasp. The crown slipped from his head, crashing upon the marble steps like a symbol of his fall. The rebels seized him, his body shaking with rage and terror. He struggled, he cursed, he promised vengeance, but his power had vanished like smoke in the wind. The throne that once lifted him above all now loomed over him like a monument to his downfall. The people stood united, their eyes fierce, their voices unbroken, and the tyrant, who had ruled with iron and blood, now stood as a prisoner in the very hall where he once declared himself untouchable. The storm of rebellion had reached its peak, and the end of cruelty was no longer a dream. It was reality, carved in the fire of freedom. The palace that had once been the symbol of Tyranny now stood in ruins. Its marble floors cracked, its golden banners torn, its throne empty and cold. The king who had ruled with an iron fist now sat in chains, his crown broken beside him, his eyes hollow with disbelief. He had believed his power eternal, yet here he was a prisoner before the very people whose cries he had silenced for years. The rebels filled the great hall, their faces marked by scars of suffering, but their eyes shining with victory. The wandering sage at last returned, walking calmly into the chamber, his presence quiet, yet more powerful than the roar of the crowd. He looked upon the fallen ruler and said, "No throne built on cruelty can escape its fate. No crown soaked in blood can outlast the truth." The people bowed not to the sage, but to the justice. His words carried. The king trembled. He shouted that he was still their master, that without him chaos would consume them. But his voice broke like glass in the storm. No one listened anymore. His power had dissolved into dust. The ministers who once praised him now begged for forgiveness. The soldiers who once feared him now stood with the people. The palace servants who once bowed to his cruelty now lifted their heads with pride. The sage declared that the throne would not belong to another tyrant, but to the people themselves, that the kingdom would be rebuilt upon justice and unity. His words spread like fire across the land, filling villages with hope, filling children with courage, filling the broken with strength. The king, dragged away from his shattered throne, screamed his curses, but his voice was nothing more than wind against the roar of freedom outside the palace. The people lit great fires, not of destruction, but of renewal. They sang songs of liberty, their voices echoing through the valleys and mountains. The land that had long been drowned in fear now breathed again. The chains of cruelty shattered, the night of oppression ended. The throne that had been a symbol of pain became a lesson for all, that no ruler, no matter how powerful, can stand against the will of the people. And as the dawn rose over the kingdom, painting the sky with gold and crimson, the story of the tyrant came to its end, and the story of freedom had only just begun.